Tonight, with a record to defend and a challenger who stood in the same place, President Biden delivers his third State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress. While the State of the Union is not officially a campaign speech, it is expected to be hard to distinguish it from one. The president is expected to defend his economic record, show that he's doing something to address migration at the border, and press for funding for Ukraine. The president is also expected to make a big announcement on the Israel-Hamas war. He'll tell Americans the Pentagon will construct a temporary seaport in Gaza to deliver critical aid to the Palestinians. After the president wraps up, Alabama Senator Katie Britt, the youngest Republican woman ever elected to the Senate, will deliver the GOP response. As is typical of the State of the Union address, the White House guest list will highlight the administration's policy priorities. That includes Jasmine Caceres, a gun reform advocate whose sister was killed in the Uvalde, Texas shooting; Sean Fain, the president of the United Auto Workers Union; and Kate Cox, who was denied abortion services in her home state of Texas. It's one of the topics where the president will draw a bright line tonight. In an excerpt from his speech, President Biden will say, quote, "Those bragging about overturning Roe versus Wade have no clue about the power of American women." He'll go on to say, "If Americans send me a Congress that supports the right to choose, I promise you I will restore Roe versus Wade as the law of the land again." We have team coverage with CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang at the North Lawn. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane is on Capitol Hill. But let's begin with Weijia. Weijia, what do we know from the White House specifically about the Gaza seaport announcement?
Well, we know that President Biden is going to make it official that he is ordering the U.S. military to construct this temporary port off the coast of Gaza. So there's another way to get aid to the more than 2 million people in Gaza who are desperate for it right now. And John, this comes on the heels of U.S. airdrops for humanitarian aid that we have been reporting on. But I think it's important to note that aid groups say that while these two routes are very important, of course, it is the most effective to transport all of these resources and supplies on the ground via convoys, trucks. And that is why the president is also insisting that Israel do more to open more routes. But John, this is a really important moment for the president to address the Arab and Muslim American community, to say that the U.S. is doing everything that it can, working around what Gaza is willing to do, what Israel is willing to do to get that aid into Gaza, because of course he faces so much criticism for his handling of the war there.
Weijia, we also mentioned in the lead up to our conversation about abortion, obviously the president will talk about that. What else are some of the things that the White House is trying to get everybody to pay attention to, or that we might expect to see in this speech tonight?
Well, his senior and arguably most important advisor, Anita Dunn, said that it's going to be about contrast, and I'll leave it there. And she was joking because she went on to elaborate about what that means. But really, you're going to see him paint a picture between what he is doing, what he plans to do, and what the country would look like if it weren't him. Read, if Donald Trump were to win the White House back. So he is going to talk a lot about defending democracy, about what's at stake there. He'll talk about the economy and making life a little better, easier for the most Americans, and making it harder on the wealthiest Americans by announcing a proposal to raise the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. He'll also talk about all the threats to rights at stake, as you mentioned, abortion, but also the threat to voting rights and civil rights. And so I think you'll see him try to make the case that this is what I plan to do. And if I am not standing here after November, you'll be facing, difficulties for all of those things. He'll also have to talk about his foreign policy as well as border security. We know that he plans to call out Republicans, I don't know to what extent yet, for not working with him on that issue, John.
And they are likely to call right back. Weijia Jiang, on the border at least anyway. Weijia Jiang at the White House. Thanks a lot, Weijia.
Yeah.
CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane is on Capitol Hill ahead of the speech. Always a great night to be a Hill reporter. Scott, you spoke with family members of Israeli hostages in Gaza. They will attend tonight's address. What do they want to hear from the president?
If you watch closely tonight, John, you'll see some people in the upper levels wearing yellow scarves in unison, marking more than 150 days since some Americans have been held hostage and not heard from in the Middle East. The parents of Omer Nutra are among them. We spoke with them earlier today. They're here from Long Island, the guest of a Democrat and Republican member of Congress, saying they do want to hear the president address the issue of hostages, the life or death struggle going on in the Middle East. They told us more. Take a listen. What do you hope or expect to hear about hostages in the address tonight?
We're hoping to get President Biden to speak about the hostage situation and make sure that the American people are aware of what happened on October 7, where 240 hostages were taken out of the beds by a vicious organization. There are still 134 hostages in Gaza, kept in horrible conditions.
What do you think the president can pledge or promise in a situation where so much is not in America's hands?
We're looking for them to ensure to keep, their hand on the handle until this is resolved. Hopefully really soon. Apply any leverage and any pressure on the different parties that are engaged and that do have influence over Hamas to make sure that a deal is accepted.
Scott.
You know how this goes, John. I'm sorry.
No,
there are
go ahead,
members who
go
bring
ahead.
guests, and they bring guests with a political message, trying to maybe poke or jab the other side. This is quite different. The Nutras, as you guessed, John, are here on a nonpartisan basis just to raise America's awareness of the hostages.
Let me ask you about Alabama Senator Katie Britt, who a lot of people are going to be introduced to maybe for the first time tonight. She will deliver the Republican response. Why was she chosen to represent the party tonight?
Several reasons. Let's start with the state she represents. Alabama has, if you haven't noticed, been quite in the news lately because of the IVF ruling from the Alabama Supreme Court. Republicans would like to defuse the political bomb that is Alabama and IVF. Katie Britt represents that state. Demographically, quite a contrast from President Biden as well. But I think there's a more fundamental issue here. She's in her first term. And in an election that we face in November, where neither candidate is really viewed as a newcomer or a change agent, Republicans are going to escalate and give a platform tonight to somebody who maybe can argue that change is needed and be viewed as a change agent, as a new member of Congress.
Big platform. Scott MacFarlane on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Scott. Joining me now is our chief election and campaign correspondent, Robert Costa, and our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes. Nancy, I'll start with you. The international headline today out of the speech, the seaport in Gaza. Would there be a seaport announcement in the speech tonight without the results in the Democratic primaries in Michigan and Minnesota with the uncommitted vote?
Oh, wow. Such a good question. There's no question, John, that the results in Michigan and even more so in Minnesota, where uncommitted got about 20% of the Democratic vote, larger than anyone expected and certainly larger than Michigan about a week before. That was a wake-up call to the Biden campaign, to the White House, that there is anger within their party and across the country more broadly, and it's not going anywhere when it comes to U.S. policy in the Middle East. And so, yes, I do think that is a factor in this decision to do something really quite unusual, establish this temporary port, which senior administration officials say the U.S. military is uniquely equipped to do within weeks, and yet won't involve any U.S. boots on the ground in Gaza. Very curious to see how they pull this off. But they are very eager to show that, at the very least, if the U.S. is not able to influence Israel to be even more careful when it comes to casualties on the ground in Gaza, at the very least, they're going to step up their humanitarian efforts. And that includes, they told us today, leading a new coalition of allies to try to boost humanitarian aid into Gaza any way they can, be it by land, by ship, or by air.
Yeah, normally 500 trucks a day, down to about 100 getting into Gaza to deliver aid. Bob, this is about as good a stage as any candidate could want. On the other hand, the State of the Union speeches usually pass very quickly into history. So frame the context, the political context for this speech now that the general election has become in clearer focus.
John, great to be with you. For President Biden, this is a moment to reintroduce himself to the country. He's a president who's so unlike his predecessor, former President Donald Trump. He's not dominating the headlines day in, day out in the United States. He's going about his business with his agenda. We're all paying attention every day in New York and Washington. But everyday Americans are not always fully familiar with what President Biden has done. I encounter that a lot on the campaign trail. And so this is a chance for them to check in with the president, to hear what he has to say, to get their real sense of him personally and politically, and for him to make his kickoff for the general election campaign.
Nancy, in that kickoff, we read the excerpt that the White House has given out. They know how to manage these things on the question of reproductive rights. Rely on your old Hill experience as a congressional correspondent. What are the chances that Joe Biden, if he's reelected, is going to get a Roe versus Wade through the Congress? And then tag on to that, is he going to address the border, and what do you think he's likely to say in this speech tonight?
Yeah, I mean, on reproductive rights, it's obviously very difficult to get anything done, particularly right now. Republicans control the House. Let's see if Joe Biden can hold on to the White House and whether Democrats can flip the House. And then, you know, there's a possibility to talk. It still would probably have to get past a 60-vote threshold in the Senate, which is, of course, not easy to do. Yes, I do think that a significant portion of the speech will be dedicated to the border, and there, White House officials say the president is going to try to thread this needle where he acknowledges that there is a problem at the border, but at the same time argues that he is trying to fix it, that he has extended a hand to the other side. He'll push for this bipartisan deal to be taken back up that the White House worked on with a handful of Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, but was rejected by the House. So he's going to call out the House on one hand for not taking it up, House Republicans in particular. On the other hand, he's trying to reach out to Republicans in the audience tonight, maybe some Nikki Haley supporters who don't necessarily love Donald Trump. And so I wouldn't expect him to be too tough on Republican lawmakers tonight. He wants to show that he is the candidate of compromise.
Bob, what's your sense of the response either from former President Trump to a night like this, or is there a coordinated Republican response that you're picking up before this speech even starts?
There is an informally coordinated Republican response. The responder is Senator Katie Britt of Alabama. She has endorsed former President Trump. So has the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, despite having his criticisms of Trump over the years, especially after January 6th, and Speaker Mike Johnson, of course, also an endorser of Trump. Collectively, that reveals a Republican Party that is in the grip of the former president as he moves closer to the nomination. And you will hear, based on my reporting in the last few days, echoes of Trump's campaign agenda in the response speech given by Senator Britt. She is seen by her colleagues as a young, dynamic voice in the U.S. Senate, but at the same time, she is someone who is comfortable being part of a party that has become Trump's party.
Robert Costa and Nancy Cordes in Washington, thank you both very much. A reminder, you can watch the State of the Union and the Republican response starting at 9 p.m. Eastern right here on CBS News. We will air a special edition of America Decides at 8 p.m. leading up to the address.